She also has a radio show and a YouTube channel. So all the links will be at the bottom of the video. This way you'll have easy access to get to any of her information. Rebecca, I would like to welcome you to the X22 Report Spotlight. Thank you for being on here.
Well, thanks, Dave. It's my pleasure to join you.
These two books revolve around what happened on September 11th. And before I start, I just want to read two quotes, one that you had on Methodical Deception, and this is from Voltaire. To find out who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize. And the second one, I just want to read the Mossad motto, by way of deception, thou shalt do war. And these two are very critical to what we're going to discuss today about 9/11. And what I wanted to do is break this down of what happened during that build up to 9/11 and how was this pulled off, because at this point we realize it was a false flag. Many of the people are starting to wake up and they're starting to realize that this was not done by Saudi Arabia. It was an inside job with the help of foreign countries. And let's break this down of how this actually occurred and how this was set up.
Sure. Well, this is kind of a long story.
Yeah.
It's quite a ways coming. And a lot of people ask me, well, who planned this? And who's the mastermind? And I think I'd like to refer people, directly to one of the things I discovered was a group of people, I would call them neocons and different business people. You'll recognize their names, and it's even a Wikipedia search will give you just a quick lowdown. It's called the Project for the New American Century. And in there, they wrote like a white paper, a book, or I guess a white paper is a great way to describe it. Rebuilding Americans' Defenses or something was the title of their white paper. Inside there, they actually called for the need for a quote-unquote new Pearl Harbor, an attack on America that would rally the general public behind these 7 pre-planned, and I say pre, that's before 9/11, pre-planned wars in the Middle East. And now, hindsight's always 20/20, so here we are 14 years later, and look at what has happened, what we have done in the Middle East. And the end result is now this ISIS creation that's strictly a Mossad CIA operation. I mean, they just arrested an Israeli colonel in Syria or Iraq, one of the two, masquerading as an ISIS leader. We just had a young boy, Joshua Greenberg, or I can't remember his name now, but he's a young Jewish American boy in Florida. You probably know about this kid, who was also masquerading online. He was a troll. We all know trolls, especially on YouTube, but anywhere on the internet there are trolls. And he was actually masquerading as an ISIS recruiter. He recruited the 2 guys that were involved in the Garland, Texas, Pam Geller freedom of speech anti-Islam thing that she did in Garland, Texas. He wasn't ISIS in reality. He's a 20-year-old kid living in his parents' basement, but he actually was recruiting someone, and unfortunately for him, he was talking with an FBI informant. And this is how he got caught. But he was recruiting this, what he thought was a young kid, to actually go to a September 11th hose run, stair climb, some kind of firefighter event. And I believe it was in Kansas this year. Take a pressure cooker bomb. He taught this kid how to make a pressure cooker bomb. So you see, there's a lot of stuff going on that isn't what it seems. And if you go just Wikipedia, the PNAC, Project for New American Century, and scroll down, you're going to see some really famous names. One of them that comes to mind is John Ellis Bush, and he goes by his initials. You probably know him as Jeb. Dan Quayle's another signer. Valerie Newland's husband, Robert Kagan. It's just amazing. You'll see them. And these are people that are paraded in front of the mainstream media as experts, terrorism experts, or financial experts or something. But those are the people who planned this event. It was planned, and actually that paper was written, I believe, in 98 and 99. So it was a long time coming. After the World Trade Center FBI bombing of 1993, coincidentally, one of the companies that got a huge contract to do the repair work was called Tridata. Tridata is a subsidiary of SPC Corporation, and the CEO of SPC Corporation was Rabbi Dov Zakheim, who was also the comptroller of the United States Pentagon, who Donald Rumsfeld had told us had misplaced $2.3 trillion with a T, trillion dollars from the Pentagon budget. And it was under investigation. And coincidentally, it was under investigation in two different offices, not next to each other, the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Army Audit Offices, both of which were blown to smithereens. All of the investigative work and the investigators were killed in the Pentagon when that missile hit. And there were also, I believe, from people that were there and that have come forward since, that some bombs were preset, actually inside the Pentagon, because they needed to make sure that investigation didn't continue. And the American people never ever heard about the $2.3 trillion that was misplaced. So it went somewhere, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. But it's coincidental that this subsidiary of SPC Corporation, Tridata, got the blueprints for the World Trade Center towers to do the construction after the 93 FBI set up bombing of that towers. So here we go. Now, I found something else interesting about SPC Corporation. And this is kind of now gets into the airline aviation stuff. In the early 90s, the company SPC Corporation went to Boeing Aircraft and they sold to them what's called a plug-in device. It's as easy as a USB plug-in for our computers. It was a plug-in device called the Flight Termination System, FTS. And this allowed them, and this is how the SPC Corporation sold it to Boeing. Boeing, in turn, sold it to some commercial carriers in the United States. It was sold in the event of a hijacking, and a hijacker should take over the cockpit. We can land the aircraft remotely. And when it was offered to us, we, flight attendants and pilots, were privy to this coming on board, and the Airline Pilots Association, the union, was not really thrilled with this, because at the time our our FAA protocols for hijacking included step-by-step protocols to follow. And in the protocols basically were the communication was from us in the cabin, because we're the eyes and the ears of the pilots. They don't know what's going on behind the cockpit door. And our job was to keep anybody out of the cockpit. And we had these step-by-step protocols to follow to do that. And then the pilots, they would communicate with air traffic controllers. Air traffic control would talk to the military, the airline company, and also, like the SWAT team or the Rangers, whoever was going to come in and liberate the aircraft. So this communication was very important. But the flight termination system, even though it's just a plug-in device, how it operates, and this is, by the way, how we operate our drones around the world to this very day, is the flight termination system. So it's very effective. It's been around. And for those that like to do a little research, you can look up Operation Home Run from DARPA. And in the 80s, this was come about. Now, it eventually got into the hands of the SPC Corporation, I guess. Somehow, magically, Israel Mossad got a hold of it. Which seems to be happening with lots of stuff like the INSLA Promise software and such. But they sold it to the airlines, and the pilot's main complaint was it operated off the same frequency as the transponder. Now, the transponder is what tells air traffic control, puts you on their radar screen and tells them you're American Flight 11, you're a 767, you're at 32,000 feet, and you're going X amount of speed. There's all of that stuff shows up due to this transponder. But if the aircraft is taken over remotely by the flight termination system, American called theirs the flight interruption system, you fall off radar and can't see you. They don't know. You'll be maybe on primary radar, but they have no idea your altitude, your speed, or who you are. You're just showing up as something moving. And so that was one big complaint is that the pilots then lost all forms of communication. They couldn't talk to air traffic control, into the company, or even to the flight attendants in the back. Now keep that in your mind now when you think about this. When I'm not really a conspiracy person. I wasn't interested. I never wanted to know the truth about 9/11. I left flying in 2004 and I never looked back. But in 2008, somewhere in there, maybe 2009, I started to write a novel. It had nothing to do with 9/11. And I wanted to just put a Middle Eastern person and a man into my book as just a walk-in character. And I thought, well, I'll just Google search 19 Arab hijackers 9/11. And when I did that, a BBC article came up from September 23rd, 2001, telling me the Saudi government was suing the FBI of the United States and that at least 6 of those guys were still alive. Now, this is like less than 2 weeks after 9/11. I'm looking at it now in 2008 or 9, 8 years later, and I'm thinking, well, how come they never changed their names? And I went to Wikipedia and I started looking, and all those same guys that were still alive, and some of them, I think 4 of them are airline pilots still. And they're still alive, and they're not guilty. And yet, if you read every bit of our history, those 6 men are still listed with their pictures and their ID and their names the same, and they're still alive flying around as airline pilots in the Middle East. And so I thought, well, that's amazing. These guys are still alive. And then I just went back in my mind and I thought, well, I remember watching it unfold. Luckily, I was home. I just kind of gotten home from Europe. And as I watched it, I remember Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon saying there was no airplane there. Well, I was watching it on TV, and behind him, there was no airplane crash there. And then I saw what they showed us in Shanksville was a ditch, and I thought, there's no airplane crash there. Part of our training is we study crashes. One reason we do that is so we can help you passengers survive. And we know what happens when a plane hits a mountain or a building or a tree or a light post, and we know the wings shear off, and we've seen bird strikes. We've all been part of hailstorms that have taken airplanes down and forced us to land because in an emergency situation. So, I mean, I'm very, very much aware of what happens when an airplane hits anything. And so when on the morning of 9/11, my phone rang and someone said, turn on the television. And I did just in time, and it could have been a replay because I realize now they're replaying all that, but I think it was live action. And I watched that supposed 767 go into the tower like a hot knife through butter. And I thought it was like trick photography, or it was a really bad rendition, updated rendition of War of the Worlds. I'm like, no, airplanes can't do that. You would not see that happen. And I'll tell you what you would see happen is when the airplane hit the building, it would have stopped and it would have blown up. And the fuel is in the wings, and that would have been a gigantic fuel ball explosion on the outside. The wings and the tail section would have all gone to the street of Manhattan. So, I mean, knowing that, I thought, oh my gosh, I've been in Manhattan plenty of times. I'm thinking all those people on the street. And that's not what happened. It just went in there right inside. And I was like, well, that's just ridiculous. And so, but I knew it was not right. And then another red flag for me was media was right away saying that the flight attendants and passengers were calling in from their cell phones from all the airplanes. And I'm like, no, they weren't. And at that point, I think what I did was I chose to go into cognitive dissonance. I'm like, you people are lying. There's no way, because cell phones still to this day don't work above 15 to 1,800 feet unless you're with a smartphone and a specially equipped aircraft. They just don't work. If you decide to get on a regular airplane, you get about 1,500 feet off the ground. It's not you can't text or you can't call. Still, 15 years later. And so I knew they were lying, but I just couldn't look back. And, especially when I was still walking the aisles, it was just really difficult. And I think a lot of Americans did that. What happened now, I can look back. In my second book, I kind of talk about this, how the CIA controls the media and how we were collectively brainwashed from that. So when I started waking up, I saw the hijackers are still alive. And then I got a hold of FBI documents that are transcripts from the flight attendants from Flight 11. And when they were making phone calls and saying things, they were not following FAA protocol. They were actually breaking protocol. They were calling places they shouldn't call, saying things that weren't important. Do you know the only real important thing they could have told the people on the ground if they could have made a phone call was how someone got inside the cockpit. And they never said that.
So let me ask you, if they couldn't make calls from the plane, how were they making calls?
Well, this is what I discovered, and then later on it's been backed up, as I was telling you off the air, by eyewitnesses. So it is not a conspiracy now. When I first discovered this, I knew when Betty Ong said he sprayed pepper spray or mace in business class and we can't breathe there. When she said that, I had enough experience with cheap perfume, even kids vomiting, other things that smell really bad on board, and it goes through the entire airplane. And if you spray pepper spray, mace, or tear gas, anything like that inside a pressurized cabin, within 2 minutes, everyone will be suffering. And, you know, she was on the phone for 27 minutes and never, ever mentioned the effects of tear gas or mace or pepper spray on her. And I thought, well, how can it be? Because if you're pressurized, you're going to be breathing that same gas that, and the hijackers would have, of course, gassed themselves. And it told me that they were no longer pressurized. From the time she made that statement and that phone call, they had to have been on the ground somewhere because she was no longer inside the cabin. And then the other person that called from Flight 11, coincidentally, and luckily for me, was another flight attendant. Now, she said she did something that was no flight attendant would do. She said the hijacker, again, just one person, was a he, and he had was seated in 9B. Well, I got to looking into who was in 9B because you would never, as a flight attendant, ever point to an innocent passenger and claim he's a hijacker, because the name of the game in a hijacking is get our airplane on the ground where it can be liberated by some hostage rescue force, you know, Delta Force, FBI, whoever's closest, they'll come and do this. And everyone's kind of got trained to do hostage rescue. So that's who would be doing this. Well, I got to looking at 9B, and he was an Israeli Defense Forces Special Operations guy it's called Sayeret Matkal. And it's Sayeret Matkal. It's a special unit of highly trained assassins. They're also trained as anti-hijacking specialists, and they're hostage rescue specialists, which is what would have come and liberated the hijacked aircraft, a hostage rescue specialist. And I thought, well, my goodness, as I read about him in his obituaries and things I'd read about him online, because there's a lot, he's a hero in Israel. And his friends from the Sayeret Matkal and the IDF said that he could kill any human being with a pen and a credit card. He had grown up in Denver. By the way, some of the identification that was stolen in Colorado and Denver. And it happened to be just coincidentally when he returned to the United States from living in Israel, which he moved to when he was 14. And he came back to go to MIT. And right around that time, coincidentally, some of these hijackers that were falsely accused, their identification was stolen. So a couple from Colorado, from Denver. At the same time, he was back to start school at MIT. And so I found that was really interesting that he was fluent in English because he grew up in the United States, so he's 14, fluent in Hebrew because he went to live in Israel when he was 14, and he was also fluent in Arabic. So he could hear anybody planning the new Pearl Harbor. And for no reason at all ever given, supposedly, the hijackers on their way to the cockpit with their plastic box cutter decided to decapitate him and stab him with the plastic box cutter. And we were led to believe he was the first fatality. That's one reason he's lifted up so high in Israel. He's a hero. He gave his life for America, you know, don't you know? Well, what I ended up finding out was he wasn't the only IDF guy on board. All the aircraft had someone related to, involved with either an Israeli corporation or IDF. It's just coincidental, I'm sure.
Yeah, I don't believe in coincidences, but go ahead.
What I saw was a flight attendant saying that, and again, she referred to just one, and I think the official story was 4 or 5 guys were supposed to be the hijackers. But you would never make that mistake. And so she called back, and actually the very first call, supposedly, according to the official story, the very first call she made out dropped after she'd made that information. So you see, you wouldn't do that because you might not be able to make another call for one reason. And let me tell you this. Our hijacking protocol was sit down and not draw attention to yourself. The last thing a flight attendant would do is sit on the phone, which both of these girls did, for 25 minutes. Because if a real hijacker were on the airplane, he saw you sitting there with your cell phone, airphone, anything, any kind of phone to your ear, you would be dead. Because obviously he would know you were talking to someone on the ground and you were going to squelch his plans. So you wouldn't do that. And those are the things I started to see. And then I looked back and Betty Ong said something else that got my attention. She said he stood upstairs. And that comment has been removed from some of the FBI transcripts. And I thought, well, that's interesting because there's only stairs in a 747 and they were on a 767. But because I've been in the airline for 30 years and I've been in places like Miramar and Air Force bases and commercial hangars, at every large hangar, hangars are large. I mean, there's big boxes that you can pull an aircraft into. The bigger the plane, the bigger the box. Mm-hmm. And there are stairs in every corner. And there are offices upstairs. And then I realized, oh my God, they're in a hangar somewhere. And that's why Betty Ong and Amy Sweet were saying different things. When they were asked, when Betty Ong was asked, where are you sitting? She didn't know the answer because she was sitting probably in an office. And so she kept saying she was seated in her jump seat 3R, which is the aft jump seat on the right side. But the other flight attendant was saying that Betty Ong is sitting with her in the second to the last row of seats, passenger seats in coach. And you wouldn't do that either because it's important that they, on the ground, people you're talking to, know where you're at. Because when the Liberation Force, the hostage rescue people come on, of course, we already had one on board. But when the hostage rescue people come on, and they're going to blast through a door and they're going to tell, this is how it works. They would tell the pilots at 8:05, we will be coming through, let's say door 3R. The aft door on the right-hand side. No flight attendant wants to sit there because those doors pop in, your jump seat folds out, you would have your legs broken, you'd be right in the middle of this crowd of hostage rescue soldiers coming in. So they would want to know that you have to say the right thing. You just have to, you're either in your jump seat or you're in a passenger seat. When I saw that, I realized that those girls were probably in two different offices because they called out at the same time.
So you're saying these people that were on the plane, they were not on a plane, they were in a different location completely.
Well, here, I kind of skipped through that. The aircraft were remotely hijacked by the flight termination system and landed at a reserve Air Force base that, later on, I found out, had indeed been evacuated of all personnel. And when the reserve unit was a C-5 transport base, a very large base in western Massachusetts, and when the reserves that were based there were activated right after the second plane hit the South Tower, they got to the base and were locked out and they were put up in hotels. And I was contacted by some of these reservists to tell me, oh my God, now I know why the planes were on our base. And then after my Facebook came out, I was on Coast to Coast AM, a lady contacted me in email. And she was an eyewitness, and she saw United 175 landing at that base so close to the ground, she thought it was crashing, that she could see people in the windows. That's how close it was. And she just thought, oh my God, there's something wrong. The planes are never this low. I mean, if you saw this at an area, I mean, she's used to seeing aircraft, both military and commercial, on a normal flight plan path to land at Bradley International and this military base. But this airplane was going the opposite direction and way too low. So she was like, oh my gosh, she thought she was witnessing a crash. She had to run to an appointment. When she got back out, she heard about the official 9/11 story, Shanksville, the Pentagon, and the tower. She thought, there's no way that plane could have gone that far. And it was going the wrong direction.
So if the plane landed in was it Westover military air base, what hit the towers?
That's a good question because that's the one question all the airline pilots contact me. Have you ever figured out how they made it look like a 767 went into that South Tower? We've never really seen anything. The only pictures that are out there of something hitting the North Tower is much smaller than a 767, and it's flying much faster than a 767. You can't even slow YouTube down to see what that is. So, and the Naudette brothers had filmed that, and they didn't release their film until like 2 days later or something. So they could have doctored their film, I don't know, but you just cannot slow it down enough to see a 767. And I have to explain to you just some aeronautics here, simple, make it real simple. A 767 can travel about 530 miles an hour, roughly, at a 35,000 foot level. Once it gets closer to the ground, like 1,100 feet or 1,000 feet off the sea level, which is where it would have been when it was hitting the tower, it cannot go that fast. The airplane will shred apart because the air is denser and they just can't go that fast. So we were collectively lied to. We were also traumatized, though, and a lot of us don't understand that if an airplane can fly 530 miles an hour at 35,000 feet, well, it probably can do that, at ground level. No, it can't. So you'll talk to pilots and people that are in the airline industry, you'll find out that no, it can't. So it wouldn't have been able to go so fast we couldn't focus on what it was, which is what happened with the North Tower. I honestly I have seen and studied crashes. I do not know the technology or how they did this, but recently I've seen some, and I don't know, I'm not saying this is how it happened. I just found the airplanes and how they did the hijacking. This is why the pilots and the flight attendants never followed hijack protocol. They didn't know they were being hijacked. They probably thought they were being, having a mechanical delay. The airplane was flying itself. And so the pilots, again, couldn't speak to the flight attendants. And Betty Ong said that. She said, the pilots aren't answering their phone. We can't talk to the pilots. And so when she said that, I realized the flight termination system had landed them. They were in a hangar somewhere. What I did then was step by step, I found, of course, the second plane was from Boston as well. And I found the flight path, their flight plan. So I knew they were south. They had to took them a few minutes longer to get landed because they had to circle around. And right where they were when that woman contacted me, west of Westover is where she lived in a town called Otis, not the Air Force Base, but a town west of Westover. This is due west of Boston. Mm-hmm. When she saw, that's exactly where I had traced the plane. I have the radar from the Freedom of Information Act data. And I knew exactly where the plane was. When she told me exactly what time she saw that United 175, I knew she wasn't lying because I knew that's exactly how it had to circle around to land at that other end of the base. And so when I started collecting now, I've got another eyewitness who saw a different aircraft coming in from a different town in western Massachusetts. So I've got military and civilian people that actually saw it. But you see, we were so collectively brainwashed with what was going on and traumatized that people just stopped thinking.
It's true.
We just didn't. I mean, if you tell me that the airplane disappeared into a Kevlar and steel reinforced brick building of layer upon layer upon layer of the rings of the Pentagon, okay, I'll believe it. I mean, that's how bad we were. Yeah. And I'm in on it. I mean, it didn't make any sense, but I couldn't get any information. So I just thought, okay, well, that's it. I'm just leaving it alone. And I think that's what a lot of people did. They just leave it alone. I'm not going to go there. And so we go into what's called cognitive dissonance, and we just refuse to look. When I found the hijackers alive, I just thought, well, I got to figure this out. Well, luckily for me, I studied organic chemistry, and I've will pull things apart molecularly, layer by layer. And so when I started to find things like the rabbi with the flight termination system and the Tri-Data doing the construction after the 93 bombing, so they had the blueprints. Here's another interesting thing about Rabbi Dobzhakin, who, by the way, when he left the Pentagon, became a vice president at this famous company, Booz Allen Hamilton. I think most people know Booz Allen Hamilton. If you don't, that's a quick Google search too. But it's very interesting. He was with a consortium of gentlemen. I don't know if there might have been a lady on there, I don't know. But a group of people, a consortium, that refurbished commercial 767s and turned them into military refueling tankers and sold them to militaries around the world. So it would have been really handy for him to pick up 4 aircraft that he could refurbish. And he did that down in Florida. And I believe it was near Eglin Air Force Base that the consortium did their work, if I remember correctly. So I found that that's a coincidence, isn't it? And if you think about this logically, and we can do this now because I'm here to help you, pull it apart logically. What would it benefit any terrorist group to destroy the evidence, not just for the good rabbi, the Pentagon comptroller, that's basically the banker. What good would it do any terrorist group, bin Laden or anyone else, to destroy the evidence and the investigation into a missing $2.3 trillion? None.
Right? It wouldn't.
Another thing I found interesting as well, that in Building 7 that fell down later on that afternoon, like at 5:30 almost, and it felt looking like a controlled demolition. I remember seeing it thinking, how did they get that thing wired for a demolition so quickly? And and so that's what I thought it was, because I'd seen them before. And
I think architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, there's like 1,200 architects and engineers looking at World Trade Center number 7, and they're saying, yes, this was a controlled demolition that brought this building down.
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, you can see it just kind of pops and it just falls into its footprint. I mean, to me, I'm not even a demo specialist, but I've been contacted by a lot of people that are, and have had some great conversations with people about how they do these controlled demolitions. And I think most people that know about it, but the thing that's interesting is the majority of Americans, because the media didn't really cover it, they showed it when it happened, they don't really know that Building 7 fell down without being hit by anything. But more interesting than that is that in Building 7, that was like the largest CIA headquarters outside of Langley, Virginia, among other things that were in there. But one of the things that they were holding is the evidence for the WorldCom, Global Crossing, and Enron trials that were coming to trial in October 2001. So all of that stuff was only, one paper. They didn't make any prints or copies or have any electronic copies, apparently. So all of that evidence just disappeared.
Wow.
Another wild coincidence about 9/11. Again, it didn't help any terrorist, but it did help some of our own people here and our best friend in the Middle East, of course.
Right.
When you look at Enron and who was involved in Global Crossing, WorldCom, and you start to look at the politicians, I mean, it doesn't take very much work to dig into who was involved with that and who was raping all the money in from it.
So how did these buildings come down? Because we know that, whatever plane or whatever hit the World Trade Center, it wasn't enough to bring those buildings down. So they couldn't have fallen on their own. And we know that impact wasn't enough to bring down both buildings. And then we see World Trade Center building number 7 brought down with a demolition. So how were the 2 towers actually brought down?
Well, that's for my first 2 books. I really I was into looking at other things. However, one of the things that I discovered that was really like I said, I tried to not use blogs and YouTube for my research. I tried to use government documents. Mm-hmm. To me, if you put it in court and it's a government document, it's probably pretty close to real, or certainly closer than a lot of conspiracy theories are. So that's kind of where I kept going. And I found something that really bothered me at first. When I first found this, and this is one thing that really kept me going, Thomas Keene, who was the chairman of the 9/11 Commission hearings, and the vice chairman, Lee Hamilton, and they together in 2006 wrote a book called Without Precedent, The Inside Story of the 9/11 Commission. And in there, and this really kept me going because this really got my attention, Thomas Keene said, the commission was, quote, so frustrated with repeated misstatements by the Pentagon and the FAA that the 9/11 Commission, considered an investigation into possible deception by these 2 government bodies concerning their response to the attacks. I read that again and I thought repeated misstatements is a political way of saying constant lying. And that was the Pentagon and the FAA. So I thought, well, let me take a look at the Pentagon involvement and the FAA, because really that's what the chairman of the 9/11 Commission told us. He also had said that the commission was set up to fail. Obviously,
right.
People really need to look at who sat and controlled the 9/11 Commission, because You want to compare these people with the signers of the Project for a New American Century. It doesn't take a lot of research. One of the things that I did when I got all this research done, and I literally did thousands of hours of research into this, was I thought, well, what am I going to do with all this information? Because most people can't do this kind of research. You just don't have time or the interest or the ability to do it. It's kind of boring. For me, I was just on a manhunt. I mean, I was like, how did they do this? So I kept tearing it apart layer by layer, and I kept finding these same players, these same connections to the military-industrial complex, to Israel, to the Mossad, to different government people. Another thing for the second book I did for Methodical Deception, I wanted to follow some of the people that should have lost their jobs, like Jane Garvey, who was the head of the FAA. And now Thomas Keene's kind of questioning the FAA, so I thought, why don't I? So I took a look at Jane Garvey, and lo and behold, did I find the most interesting thing about her. She at one time was the director of Boston Logan Airport. So Jane Garvey knew that Boston Logan Airport never had any cameras in the terminal at all to keep us safe and secure and to go back and look at. So we know who was on the plane and who was a hijacker or not. Was anybody on? Or you can make up, by the way, the FBI completely falsified the 19 Arabs on the manifest. The passenger manifest didn't have any Arabs on them, the real ones. But the FBI, this is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Most people were raised to believe that they're going to investigate, they're going to find the truth, right? They're covering up all of this stuff. But interesting thing about Jane Garvey, and another crazy coincidence, her husband is the sheriff for the county that surrounds the northwest and the most northern part of Westover Air Force Base. So the lady that contacted me to tell me that she saw United 175 landing, had she called 911, her report would have been circular filed and shredded, or she would have been silenced, but her report would have gone nowhere. Because Jane Garvey, the administrator of the FAA at the time's sheriff, husband happened to be the sheriff right there. Now, how convenient is that? Pretty convenient.
Yes.
And, for me, stuff I was looking at, too, is like, how in the world, and according to the official story, there were bombs on 2 planes. There were knives, box cutters, mace, pepper spray. All of those things were illegal to bring through security. So I thought, well, who in the world was running through security? This is Washington, D.C., Dulles International. That's right where the heart of our government is. And how could they not have decent security that they allowed that on as a flight attendant? Now that's how I'm thinking. Mm-hmm. So I had to see who's running security there. And lo and behold, it's a company out of Israel, ICTS International. Now, what's really troubling to me is as I looked into this, because their subsidiary in the United States was called Huntley, USA, and I knew the name because they were running security at almost every major airport in the United States. Still to this day, ICTS International runs security out of almost all of Europe. As a matter of fact, they were running security at Charles de Gaulle when Richard Reed, the tennis shoe bomber, was allowed to get on board the plane with a tennis shoe bomb. After that, we all had to remove our shoes, still do. They also were running the security out of Amsterdam Schiphol Airport when the Abdul Muttalib panty bomber was allowed to get on the plane without a passport and put on by somebody who was with some intelligence agency that forced the airline to put him on without a passport. That's really hard to do, I'm here to tell you. And they allowed him to get through security with PTN in explosives, plastic explosives in his underwear. Now, he almost brought an airplane down on Christmas Day. So, into Detroit. And that was a Northwest Airlines aircraft. But that didn't happen only because the bomb didn't really take off. But the minute he did that, Michael Chertoff was working with a company that he owned and had the backscatter machines, the naked X-ray machines, all ready to go. And within 30 days, they were being put into our airports. And interesting, Michael Chertoff's really connected to a lot of companies. One of the companies I found that was really interesting was P-Tech and MITRE. And P-Tech is a foreign-owned company also. And their marketing guy was a Jewish attorney from Boston area. friend of Michael Chertoff, because Michael Chertoff got P-Tech into 22 U.S. government computer systems, and they had a backdoor installed where they could control anything they wanted. And let me just tell you this. P-Tech at the time of 9/11 was in control through the back door and this promised software that they'd put in to these systems. 22 United States government computer systems included Air Force One, the White House bunkers, the FAA, NORAD, the United States Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the list goes on, and it's in Methodical Illusion that I really laid that out. So we had a foreign-owned startup company, and it's interesting because the financiers of it were Lebanese, and they all go trace back to a terror group called MEK, and they're really not involved with the terror group. They're just the financiers, but that they connect to a bunch of United States politicians who also connect to the terror group MEK. They've been trying to get that removed from the terror list because I think they were going to try to get them operating as something like ISIS. So it's just amazing the combination of stuff that you find. I probably sidetracked from your question. For how the buildings were brought down, I think one of the things I found that was very disturbing to me was a DEA document, 61 pages, that talked about some Israeli art students. And it's interesting, it was kind of a spy on spy situation. The Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, was actually following a group of Israelis that they thought were an ecstasy drug ring. Found out where they were a group of Mossad agents and IDF people that were masquerading as art students around the United States on tourist visas, selling artwork to federal government agencies, DEA, IRS, U.S. Marshals, and they were showing up at these people's homes. So the DEA first starts thinking, wait a minute, I mean, this office isn't even public knowledge where we're at. And these guys are showing up, and they started asking security questions and asking for blueprints, and some of them had blueprints of their offices and their locations. So there were locations the U.S. government thought they were private and quiet and basically not public knowledge. And so they started to think, well, are they tapping our phones or what? So they started then the government agencies, and this all came out of the DEA. And so it's actually all of this information links from my methodicaldeception.com resources pages, and there's about 5 pages of these artists and the DEA reports there and everything. So his concern was shared among a bunch of people across the country, because they would go to an Air Force base where, say, they have a museum, and then they would walk out onto the active runway and take pictures of each other. So they got some really weird behavior going on, but you'll remember the 5 dancing Israelis in New Jersey?
Right.
That's what they were doing. They were taking pictures. They were lighting their lighters in front of the towers, and they had cameras, and they were rejoicing up and down, and they were, thanks to Michael Chertoff, they were sent home to Israel where they can never be brought back and prosecuted here in the United States. Well, they weren't alone. There were about 250 Israeli quote-unquote spies that were rounded up after 9/11 and put on an El Al aircraft and sent home to be safe.
So why was the direction of who did this? They were looking at Saudi Arabia. Then, of course, they said it was Al-Qaeda. Everything away from who actually really did it.
Well, remember, the 5 dancing Israelis told the police officer, the Palestinians are your problem. They tried to blame, and they did the same thing with Pan Am 103, and I found some interesting stuff too, because then I started to see, we've been lied to so much about this. Well, what about other things that had happened? I've actually got a person that contacted me that was an eyewitness to someone with a shoulder-held surface-to-air missile that was aimed at an American airplane that came down out of JFK in November of 2001. Remember that American crash?
Mm-hmm.
And right away said it wasn't terrorism, and they basically never talked about it anymore. They just talked about 9/11. Well, she saw 2 guys with a now you know the area, right?
Right.
just north of JFK.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's called Bell Harbor area neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
If I remember correctly. I think it's near Jamaica, but I don't remember all the neighborhoods in New York. But yeah, she saw people with in America, come on, how often do you see someone with a shoulder held surface to air missile in your neighborhood?
Right.
And so, and it's interesting too, you'll see that when the government is covering something up or making something up, prime example right now is the Russian plane that was taken out of the sky in the Sinai. There was a huge military drill going on by Israel and the United States 20 miles away from there. And coincidentally, at 9/11, there were huge drills going on. FEMA was drilling in Manhattan and had arrived the night before. So you saw that whole thing. It's just too much. You see the drill, you see the blaming someone. And remember, it was Ehud Barak, interestingly enough, coincidentally, that was in the BBC studios. And you'll remember it was the BBC studios that Jane Stanley was standing with the Solomon Building, Building 7, right behind her, still standing, 20 minutes before it collapsed, telling us that it had collapsed. Well, someone had to put that in her teleprompter to tell her that it was going on. Coincidentally, Ehud Barak was in the studio at BBC. He is also the guy who told us that it was Osama bin Laden and we needed to instigate the war on terror. So that was kind of interesting to me. How would he know he's in London?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole thing, it was scripted, and the way they presented it, it was just missed timings of when they should have done it. And it seems like they always make these little mistakes.
Well, you saw a lot of big mistakes. As I continued looking into the second book, let me just finish about the Huntley USA. This is what blew me out when I was researching for the Methodical Deception. I'm looking into the ICTS International. It was started by an Israeli guy who ended up going to prison for fraud, campaign finance fraud, and making fraudulent documents. This is a guy who owned ICTS International, right? The guy, they failed us in Charles de Gaulle. They failed us in Amsterdam. They failed us at Newark and Logan and Dulles Airport on 9/11, right? They failed to catch all of those weapons and bombs and everything. Well, lo and behold, who do you think's sitting on their board of directors right now? None other than the secretary, Secretary of Transportation at the time of 9/11, Norman Mineta. Now, why would Norman Mineta go with an Israeli-owned company that failed that badly? Or did they fail? Maybe they didn't fail. Maybe one of the things that happened right after 9/11 is that all foreign-owned companies were given a walk. They cannot be prosecuted. Security companies allowed all this to happen. It happens to be an Israeli company who now is joined by Norman Mineta. I mean, I just like, well, then it can't be a failure. So when I started to see these people that, and this is coming from Thomas Keane. He pointed out the Pentagon and he pointed out the FAA. And so I'm thinking, okay, well, he's telling us that those two units are lying to us. And a lot of times after my first book came out, and I did a bunch of interviews, people were saying, what about Barbara Olson? Remember Barbara Olson? She was on Flight 77 that hit the Pentagon.
Right.
I said, well, let me look into Barbara Olson. And then I saw Ted Olson. Now, by the way, Ted Olson just coincidentally was the attorney for the Israeli Mossad spy Jonathan Pollard. And so I'm looking at Barbara Olson and I think, oh, this is really interesting. Barbara Olson graduated from college in Texas, and then she went to Hollywood. Most people in Hollywood act.
Right.
Learn how to act. But there is nothing, and anybody that can find it, send it my way. There is nothing about what she did other than she claimed she worked for Stacy Keach Productions. Remember, Stacy Keach got busted for cocaine in 1986 in Europe, in the UK, going into London, I believe, and spent a year in prison, I believe, over there as well. So she was working during that time for Stacy Keach Productions, but you can't really find anything about Stacy Keach Productions. I don't even know if they really existed. And she worked for HBO. Well, HBO's got a real big connection to the CIA too. So But other than that, we don't know if she was acting. She could have been doing commercials, and we could have all seen her do shampoo commercials, and we didn't know who she was because she wasn't on CNN then. But she was doing something that you can't find anything of what she was. She could have been a copy girl. We don't know. But she decided after a decade, 10 years in Hollywood, that she would go to law school. And lo and behold, she goes to an Orthodox Jewish law school called Yeshiva University. You probably know it because it's in your old stomping grounds. And they're Ben Cordova Law School at the Yeshiva University. She goes there. She graduates from there, and she walks into the top dog law firm in Washington, D.C., Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering. Well, Wilmer and Cutler and Pickering have some really interesting connections to not just the White House, but to 9/11. And these just blew me away. Now, Cutler, he was the White House counsel for President Carter and then again for Bill Clinton. And then C. Boyden Gray, you might remember him. He was the White House counsel for Senior Bush, George H.W. Bush, when he was vice president and then when he became president. Another person who was later on became a partner at Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering was Jamie Gorelick. And Jamie Gorelick was one of the members of the 9/11 Commission. And already I said to you, one of the things I found was the FBI was covering up all this. It was the FBI that went to the Pentagon and gathered up 80 or over 85, somewhere I've read about 88 closed circuit cameras from around the Pentagon, on top of the Pentagon, and businesses surrounding the Pentagon within 30 minutes of whatever it was that hit. So the FBI seemed to know that something was going to hit the Pentagon, I'm sure. And in 2014, the former FBI Robert Mueller, who was the head of the FBI at the time of 9/11, joined that same law firm. And I'm thinking, well, this is just coincidental. It has coincidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Find their client list. And this is where the bottom just dropped out for me. At the top in alphabetical order of their client list is Akamai Technologies. Do you remember the guy 9B that the flight attendant said was the hijacker?
Right.
Daniel Lewin. He was the CEO of Akamai Technologies. Okay, so the traveling artists that kind of got busted, and once they started IDing them, and they were all over the country. They were in Chicago, and by the way, United Airlines lost their phone and internet service the morning of 9/11. There's a company.
I'm just sighing here. I'm just saying, whoa.
Well, while the DEA started waking up to these traveling Israeli artists. You see, when you're here on a tourist visa, it's illegal to work. And they were selling art. They were buying $8 prints in China and then selling them to these federal agents and their wives, going to their doors and at their home and stuff, and selling them for $150, right? Well, that's illegal. And so when they started to find that out, they also started IDing these guys. Some people started saying, wait a minute, something's wrong with these Israelis coming around to our door. How do they find us? So the two companies that bailed them out because they were caught with like $180,000 cash. You'll read all this in the DEA reports off my website. These two companies that would bail them out each time, one was called Amdocs, and lo and behold, in alphabetical order, the client list from the Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering is Amdocs. Now, what are the chances of that? Well, Amdocs is an Israeli company, and they actually were monitoring every single phone call because they were actually hired by our phone companies to, when we all had to pick up our phone, and if you had to call the neighborhood next door and it was long distance, they monitored all of that for billing purposes. They also could listen in to, so there were two companies that bailed these artists out. One was Amdocs, and the other one was all capital letters, like kind of like MITRE is. And it's NICE, like nice. And nice, and you want to take notes on this one because this gets a little, we get moving kind of quickly here. So you have to relist this. NICE was started out by 7 special operations Israelis, and I believe they came from Shin Bet. And Shin Bet is like our secret service that protects our president and stuff.
Right.
Okay, so Shin Bet started this, and they're actually, NICE is actually now monitoring most of the city of Glasgow, Scotland, with cameras and microphones on the street. But the Amdocs and NICE would bail these guys out to the tune of, $10,000 to $20,000 each time. So another company I found was a client for Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering, where Barbara Olson worked, was called Avid Technologies. And now, if this wouldn't be useful, Avid Technologies is a company that specializes in video and audio production technology. And they have one specialty called digital nonlinear editing, NLE. And the best example of this for me to give you right now, since it's NFL season, is the line of scrimmage. If you're watching on television, you see the bright orange, they have to move the ball every 10 yards or so. And
Right.
that little line of scrimmage comes out, and it's bright orange on TV. And then you'll see the team logo with an arrow saying, okay, they're moving the ball this way on your screen, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's all invisible when you're in the stadium, but you can see it perfectly on television screens and cameras. So I'm thinking, well, how handy would that be to make things slide into a video real quickly? It's video, audio, and video editing. And then I started to look at some of the replays of the news, and there's a couple different camera angles, but interestingly enough, the same screams are they sound like the same little audio segment of screams going on. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And then they're connected to, and this is information for you because this was your business. Besides Boeing, they were also connected to Citigroup Bank, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, Goldman Sachs, HSBC Finance, JP Morgan Chase, and the UBS banks. Now, if you've done any research into or talked to Scott Bennett into terrorist financing, some of those will sound really familiar. And lo and behold, the Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering also were a part of a special investigating committees for the board of directors for Enron and WorldCom. Remember 7?
Mm-hmm.
So all these connections. Wow, this is amazing. They also represented GE, Monsanto, Morgan Stanley, and lo and behold, here's one more interesting. Oracle. Do you remember Scott Beamer, Let's Roll?
Yes.
He worked for Oracle. Now, the interesting thing about Oracle was that Larry Ellison, who's the CEO of Oracle, had released the Let's Roll hero story 12 hours before it was public information. 12 hours before Scott Beamer's wife heard this story, anybody from the airline heard this story, or the FBI released this information. Larry Ellison from Oracle, the CEO, had put it out in an email to his entire corporation, the whole Let's Roll hero story of Todd Beamer. And another interesting thing, from the 9/11 Commission and the Zachariah Moussaoui trials, Todd Beamer's cell phone continued to make phone calls in and around New Jersey until around 9 p.m. Now, remember what was left of the titanium engines on Flight 93? Nothing.
Yeah.
His cell phone lived through this along with that paper passport.
Yes, the paper passports there weren't untouched.
His phone can make calls without Todd Beamer's phones pushing the buttons miraculously until around some 8:30, 9 o'clock that night. So I'm thinking, well, this is just getting to be way too much coincidence because I was just looking into Barbara Olson. And so that's another thing. On Flight United 175, there was another Israeli Defense Forces woman. Her name was Alana Abraham, and she was a passenger. You don't hear much about her, but she worked for a company that is also on the client list called Applied Materials. And you can look up Applied Materials and what they do, who they're involved with. But they bought about 3 or 4 Israeli companies. And she was living in Israel. She just came here for 9/11, I guess, coincidentally. And so she was just quietly sitting there as a passenger. So, when you start to see these kind of things line up, then you just can't deny it anymore. That now, after my second book came out, I've been contacted by people from DARPA. That's why I say look up Operation Home Run. That's how they first figured out how to do controlled, remote controlling aircraft. And that has been going on since 1970s, early, like 1973. This is not new technology. It's just that the traveling public didn't know that they could do this. I did. And I happened to be in conversations with pilots. The reason they didn't want it, and the airline I worked for did not have it, but they also have this, so they could have gone on clandestinely and plugged it into the computer for any airline. And by the way, George W. Bush made it mandatory that every airplane now has a remote control device, and Boeing has come out with their own system. They patented their own remote control system so that this can happen. Eventually, it'll be set up so that air traffic controllers can remotely land the aircraft.
Wow.
With satellite technology, it's just not all in together yet. But I've had air traffic controllers come and help me go through this Freedom of Information Act data. And so, and listen, it is not just the Mossad. They were very heavily involved. And what's happened, what I found is that there's a lot of dual citizens that have become CEOs of companies like Dov Zakheim. How could a dual citizen be the head of our Pentagon? But it's true, and he was, and I mean, it continues to happen. And one of the other things I found out that this PTEC has just changed their name 2 or 3 times. They're still in control, and through the backdoor technology and the software they've used into our government systems, they also are in control of, and Huntley USA still is doing security for not our airports, but our biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons and our nuclear reactors.
Let me ask you, I mean, from all of this that you've been doing and all this research, right now we understand, and I just want to clarify something here. Why hasn't anyone come forward from the incidents, or have they been paid off, or are they all dead?
You're talking about people that were, well, I call them handlers.
I mean, there had been a lot of people involved in this.
Well, you know, I've had some chats with people that are kind of into special operations and stuff, because that was a question I had too. And you got to understand, I mean, for me, my concern was to find out what did they do with the crew members, especially with the passengers and the crew members.
Right.
And as I started, digging through this, I think that there was a rather large contingency, and that $2.3 trillion that disappeared, that wasn't the only thing that happened that was worth a lot of money. There was a ton of gold under the World Trade Center towers that disappeared. And so there was a lot of people that could have been paid off. And I guess you just have to ask yourself, if someone came to you and said, of course, they wouldn't have told you what this was, we need you to do something, and here's $100 million. Would you do it? And it'll mean you never see your wife or kids again. Has their price tag. And so I'm just assuming that anybody that started to quiver met a bullet. And some of these people, you have to understand too, that some of these people are not human. They're sociopaths, psychopathic weirdos that they will do anything for money. And so they would probably do it again if it meant they could get another $100 million or whatever they got, or amount of gold they got, or whatever. So it was, but how the military works, it was very compartmentalized. I've actually been contacted by someone who had a family member that was called up to disarm. Remember, the Pentagon was the most heavily protected building in the world.
Right.
It had at least 3 systems of protection around it. Not one of them worked on 9/11. I actually got an email from someone who had a conversation with someone that a family member had been called up by, I can't remember now if it was Cheney or Rumsfeld. I think it was Cheney though, to disarm the Pentagon. And he can't talk about it. And he will not talk about it. He did it. He went up there and disarmed it. That's why none of the protection worked that day.
So many people with the Pentagon believe it wasn't a plane. It could have been a missile. What do you think it was that actually hit the Pentagon?
Well, since I have this, not just radar, but I also have transcripts of what was going on in the towers.
Mm-hmm.
There is a target coming to the Pentagon on primary radar. I think I've even found the location. I got some help with me, so I think I should say, have found the location that the missile was launched from. And I have someone's words saying that it was 1 minute out, 1 minute before the Pentagon was hit, and on primary radar only. And that's how it would show up, because it doesn't have a transponder. Primary radar. So right now I'm pretty sure that it was a missile, and I think I know exactly where it was launched from. So they compartmentalize. There have to be people that know what they did, but they just got paid off to stay quiet. You can only compartmentalize so much. I mean, I'm looking at now, I'm thinking, my goodness, if they came to me and said, listen, I need you as a flight attendant to do something, and it's going to be this much money. Your kids will always be, well taken care of, blah, 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 but they won't have you. I mean, you have to ask yourself, what would be your price tag? Do you have one? I don't. I just,
Yeah.
not that bad. No?
I do not have a price tag. I just couldn't even imagine doing it or thinking that way, or it just wouldn't even come into my brain. And it's just amazing that people would actually do this for money and, leave family and kill people and not think twice about it. It's just amazing to me.
Yeah. So there was, and people ask me all the time, well, who was real, who wasn't? Well, all I can do is find the connections. As a matter of fact, all of the heroes on Flight 93, those guys were all 6'1" to 6'4", 220 plus pounds. They all played rugby. One of them was a judo champion. One of the flight attendants on one of the planes was a black belt in karate. And I mean, why would nobody do anything? It just doesn't make any sense at all. Because I mean, it doesn't. In a real hijack situation, the hijackers were 5'6", 5'7", 5'8". I think one of them might have been 5'9", and one of them might have been over 5'9". But in general, they were really tiny people. And so when you got guys like the guy that called in from 175 that thought he was over Ohio, I traced where the aircraft supposedly was according to the government. And you'll like this because I know if you close your eyes, you can see this. He was 5,000 to 10,000 feet above the Hudson going north, and to the left side, which is where he was sitting, was Newark International Airport. And you know what that looks like.
Oh,
on
yes.
the aircraft is the Statue of Liberty. And at the time he was telling his mother on the telephone, he thinks he's over Ohio. That guy's a liar.
Yeah, maybe he wasn't even in the air at that time. Maybe
they weren't. They were in a hangar somewhere.
Yeah.
But according to, I mean, I have where they're supposed to be according to the government. But one of the things also about Flight 93 at the time of the Let's Roll Hero story, took place like at 9:57. That plane was coming out of the sky 6,000 to 10,000 feet per minute. Think about that. That's a rapid descent. You couldn't even stand in the aisle. And we're supposed to believe that they brought a beverage cart or meal cart with coffee pot of hot water in to crash it through the cockpit door, right? That's what it's coming out of the sky at a 40 plus degree angle, 6,000 to 10,000 feet a minute, according to the U.S. government, and upside down. Now, at the same time, it was have a guy named Edward Felt, and for some reason the FBI didn't want to let us know about Edward Felt, but I ended up finding out that Edward Felt was connected to Oracle as well. Most of the people that called in, like the guy who couldn't recognize Newark International, the Hudson, and the guy sitting next to him or across the aisle from him on row 31 on the right side of the plane, couldn't recognize the Statue of Liberty, told his dad he thought the hijackers were going to fly him to Chicago and fly him into a building. In reality, if he had been there, he would be saying he thought they were probably going to land at LaGuardia.
Right.
I mean, when you're coming out of the sky, when you've been at 42,000 feet and now you're between 5,000 and 10,000 feet. And the only reason I say that is all the documents have them at a different altitude. So I can tell you where they really were, because they don't even know where they really were, because it's all different. And like, what the hell? You're only in one place, especially when you're in a busy airspace like Newark and New York. I mean, you got Teterboro, you got Newark, you got JFK, and you got LaGuardia right there. You've got to know if you're at 5,000 feet or 10,000 feet, but they don't know. And I've got all the documents to prove they don't know. Lying, because they're just making stuff up, pulling it out of their hat. But, he would have been saying we're landing somewhere, because even 10,000 feet, that's when the green light goes off and we tell you, ladies and gentlemen, please discontinue the use of all electronic devices. Right. And that, you're landing at that point. And so I'm thinking, well, none of the script I was reading made sense with what the planes were doing. And then when you find out that Oracle CEO knew the Let's Roll Hero story, and his phone kept making phone calls, you gotta wonder. And I do wonder. I'm not sure how many of those people are still alive, but some of them did make it. And I've actually found the getaway plane, and it's not one of the 4.
Really?
How they did it, and it's going to be in the next book. And I've always shared that information, so they can't Breitbart me. It's all right in government documents, and I just needed some government people to come in, and they have, God bless them. They have come forward and helped me read through and see what I was looking at. See, like for me as a flight attendant, when I saw protocol broken, not being followed, the last thing you would do is call your mom and dad or your spouse. We all have a phone number that's direct to crew scheduling that has a direct line to air traffic control, FAA, and the FBI. That's who we would call. You wouldn't call your parents. My goodness, they wouldn't know what to do.
Right.
And they would panic. I mean, even now, I think, gosh, when my daughter called me and she said, I'm on a hijacked plane, I'd panic. And I know what I should do, but it's my kid. So it's those kind of things that we were told not to do. And here's another thing that people just don't understand this, and they need to understand this. In a hijacking situation, we had step-by-step protocols, including code words to use. The passengers don't know them. And so when Brian Sweeney also said this on 175, but this is the scenario from Flight 93, when the passengers are going to get up and take the cockpit back from the hijackers, we would never have allowed a passenger to get up and do anything in a hijacking. Now, a hijacking is different than an out-of-control customer. If you have somebody that's on spice or crack or something that loses it or just claustrophobic, then we need you to help us contain them. That's different than a hijacking. And we were in a hijacking at this point. We would never allow you to get up because we won't know if you could really continue to be a hero, or you might wet your pants and you might get in our way, or you might sue the airline. So you're not going to get up and help in a hijacking. And when I saw that, I thought, well, wait a minute. This is whoever did this, you could say, made some huge mistakes in their planning. Cell phones don't work. But cell phones do work if you're a prime minister or a president or a military leader. They all have video telephone from those airplanes. But you and I don't. Our phones don't work at altitude still to this day. So you see, the planners, they didn't know, they hadn't been trained as a flight attendant. They didn't know our protocol. And so they thought none of you people out there, none of us, and for us, and people always ask me, how come more airline people haven't come forward? Well, for one thing, the 9/11 truth movement's full of crazy people. And I've been attacked after my second book came out by people that are crazy truth people that are, they don't think I was a flight attendant, this and that, the other. They don't care what I exposed. And in the back of the book, and I know you got the Kindle, but in the back of the book part, and that's why I said I'll send it to you too. I'll be happy to send you a set of hardbacks of this, because in the back of the book, one of the things I discovered is that the radar that was what we were led to believe the flight paths that the airplanes took was uploaded before the planes even took off. So there's no way they can tell you that the airplane was here at 8:30. And that's why when I'm looking at this plane 175, I have an eyewitness that saw it landing, and the government has an FAA and NORAD have two different altitudes and kind of two different little bits locations. And so I realized that this is really weird. Well, one day we're looking over, and all of a sudden you look at the meta tags on the radar files that were uploaded to the FAA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and they started uploading voice files of the quote-unquote terrorists who would have been called a hijacker at that time, and the radar pass that they would like you to believe the planes took, whether they went over Stewart or Albany, New York, or this or that or the other thing. And those radar paths were uploaded before crash time, before they knew it was hijacked, or in some cases before pushback. Some of them at 6 in the morning, some at 5:56 in the morning.
Wow.
So, and what happened was, unfortunately, they just forgot. When you save a document on a computer, it meta tags it. It stamps it as this was saved, November 12th at, X hour, minute, and second.
That's absolutely correct.
And that's what's in, and I don't think it shows up very good in the Kindle from what I've been told. So, but in the books, it's there and it's real. And the reason I put stuff in the appendix is some of the truther people that didn't believe my first book, I guess. It's weird. It's a personal attack. It isn't about, they haven't even read the book. It's very strange, but to me, it makes them look like they're working for the perpetrators. So when you have a DEA document that points out people's military ID and the fact that they're a bomb expert, then later on, the group of artists that were living on the 91st floor of the World Trade Center towers, the Gelatin Group, they're a group of, again, Jewish artists from Austria. They came, and they were housed in the 91st floor by the Lower Manhattan Cultural Center, who also had a little office up there. And there are pictures on my website of them, and the boxes that are behind them correlate to power bar fuse holders that can be used for really wiring your house or your building, but these buildings had been wired since the 70s. And they can also be used for remote control demolition. You look at the pictures, and they did a book about this called The Bee Thing, and I just talked to someone that paid $500 to get a copy. But when you click on all the links and the resource pages from methodicaldeception.com, you'll see those pictures with those boxes behind them. And then if you continue to click on, I think the lower right side are some links, click here for more. There are drawings, and if you think these people are artists, then you got to think again. I'm sick about this. And Sean at SGT Report and I just did a quick video about the artwork. So you can go over to sgtreport.com on YouTube and watch this one. Because Sean, after our first interview, didn't know about this, had gone and he uncovered a lot of their art and how sick it is. It shows people jumping out of the buildings.
Wow.
There's a picture that they have from inside the 91st floor, looking out. Now, if you've ever been in the World Trade Center, you remember there's tall, skinny windows and then like a little partial wall and then a window and a partial wall, and it went all the way along the room. Well, in between on the wall section, they wrote EXIT on a letter on each partial wall. Exit.
Oh, my God.
It's so sick.
Yeah.
I haven't had a chance to look at the video, but I knew the artwork that Sean had, and we discussed it. And a lot of it I had put into my webpage too. So we had some of the people that were busted as the traveling artists going around to these federal buildings were actually joined at the Gelatin Group. And they were Israeli bomb experts from the Mossad.
Huh. Rebecca, I appreciate you coming on the X22 Report Spotlight. Thank you for all of this information, and for everyone that wants to read her book.